I was 23 when Caleb and I got married, and he was only 22, which everyone kept saying was too young, but we knew what we wanted. Caleb had this sweet, gentle way about him that made me feel like I was the center of his universe, which was exactly what I needed after all the jerks I'd dated before. He was the type who would ask permission before changing the TV channel and actually cared about my opinions on everything from what we had for dinner to how we arranged the furniture. The thing is, Caleb's niceness sometimes felt suffocating. Like when we'd be out somewhere and I'd mention that some guy was attractive, just normal conversation, the way people talk. Caleb would get this hurt look and go quiet for the rest of the night. It was honestly exhausting having to monitor every little comment to protect his feelings. I'd end up snapping at him about being too sensitive, and he'd apologize like he'd done something wrong by getting upset. What the hell was I supposed to do? Pretend I was blind to other men just because we were married? But I loved him, and when he got orders for deployment overseas, I genuinely thought I'd miss him terribly. The night before he left, we stayed up talking about how we'd handle the distance, making all these romantic promises about writing letters and video calls. Caleb kept saying how much he trusted me, and how lucky he felt to have a wife who could handle being independent while he was gone. I remember feeling proud that he saw me as strong and capable. The first few weeks after Caleb left were actually harder than I expected. The house felt too quiet, and I'd catch myself setting 2 plates for dinner out of habit. But after about a month, something shifted. I started appreciating having the bed to myself, not having to check with anyone before making plans, being able to watch whatever I wanted on TV without negotiating. For the first time since we'd gotten married, I could just be myself without constantly considering someone else's feelings. That's when I ran into Griffin at Whole Foods. I was in the produce section trying to remember if Caleb had mentioned wanting me to eat healthier in his last call when someone said my name. Griffin had been a friend back in high school. One of those guys who was always funny and confident in a way that made everyone want to be around him. He looked good, really good, with this easy smile that reminded me why I'd had such a crush on him back then. We ended up talking for almost an hour right there in the store. He was working in construction now, had his own place. Seemed like he had his life together in this relaxed way that felt so different from Caleb's constant need for structure and approval. When Griffin asked for my number, saying we should catch up properly sometime, it felt completely innocent. We were old friends. I was lonely, and Caleb wasn't here to get weird about it like he probably would've. Griffin and I started texting pretty regularly after that. Nothing inappropriate, just friendly conversation about our days, memories from high school, random thoughts about movies or music. He was easy to talk to in a way that felt effortless, never making me feel like I had to be careful with my words. When Caleb would call, our conversations felt stilted and forced compared to the natural flow I had with Griffin. Caleb would ask the same questions about my day, give me updates about base life that all sounded identical, and then we'd run out of things to say after 15 minutes. Griffin, on the other hand, would text me random observations that made me laugh, ask my opinion on things like he actually valued what I thought, and remembered details from previous conversations. When he mentioned maybe moving to Alaska for a job opportunity, asking if I'd ever thought about living somewhere completely different, it felt like the kind of adventurous conversation I never got to have with Caleb. I found myself looking forward to Griffin's messages more than Caleb's scheduled calls. About 3 months into the deployment, Caleb came home on leave for 2 weeks. I was excited to see him, but something felt off from the moment he walked through the door. He seemed different, more serious, more watchful. The second night he was home, he asked to see my phone while we were watching TV. Just casual, like he wanted to check the weather. But when he started scrolling through my messages, his whole body language changed. "Who's Griffin?" he asked. And his voice had this tight quality I'd never heard before. I felt this weird hollow feeling in my stomach, but I kept my voice normal. Just an old friend from high school. We ran into each other at the grocery store. Caleb was quiet for a long time, reading through our conversations. The messages looked different seeing them all together like that. And I realized how often Griffin and I had been texting, but it wasn't like we were saying anything wrong. It was just friend stuff, normal conversation between people who enjoyed talking to each other. "Some of these messages seem pretty close," Caleb said finally, "like this one where he's talking about Alaska and asking if you'd ever want to start over somewhere new." I could feel myself getting defensive. "Are you serious right now?" He's talking about a job opportunity and making conversation. Am I not allowed to have friends just because you're not here to supervise me? Caleb looked like I'd slapped him. That's not what I meant. It's just the way he talks to you and how much you guys text every day. It feels like more than friendship. Well, it's not, I said, probably more sharply than necessary. Griffin is a friend, Caleb. I'm sorry if that threatens you, but I can't just sit in this house like a nun waiting for your phone calls. We ended up fighting about it for hours. Caleb wasn't accusatory exactly, but he had this hurt, confused way of asking questions that made me feel like the bad guy for having a social life. Finally, he asked, not demanded, asked if I would stop talking to Griffin while he was deployed. Said it would make him feel better about being so far away. I agreed because I loved my husband and didn't want him worrying while he was overseas. But honestly, I felt resentful about it. Caleb was basically asking me to cut off a friendship because he couldn't handle me talking to another man. It felt controlling and unfair, especially when I hadn't done anything wrong. After Caleb went back to base, I kept my promise for about 2 weeks, but Griffin kept texting, asking why I'd gone quiet, saying he missed our conversations. When I finally responded, explaining that Caleb had gotten weird about our friendship, Griffin was so understanding about it. He said he respected my marriage, but thought Caleb was being unreasonable, that a secure husband wouldn't feel threatened by his wife having male friends. That made sense to me. I started texting Griffin again, but I was more careful about it. I changed his contact name to something neutral and turned off the message previews on my phone. It wasn't because I was doing anything wrong. It was because Caleb couldn't handle the truth about normal friendship, and I didn't want to cause problems over something so innocent. Around the same time, my dad died suddenly of a heart attack. I was devastated, completely unprepared for how much it would hit me. Caleb tried to be supportive from overseas, but there's only so much comfort you can get through a phone screen. I needed someone physically present, someone who could actually be there during the worst days. That's when Silas came into my life. We met at a coffee shop near my dad's house when I was there dealing with funeral arrangements. I was crying over paperwork, feeling completely overwhelmed, and Silas was the barista who brought me tissues and asked if I was okay. He had this gentle, caring energy that felt like exactly what I needed right then. Silas and I started talking regularly after that. He'd check in on how I was handling the grief, listen when I needed to vent about family drama around the funeral, offer to help with practical stuff when I felt overwhelmed. He was going through his own rough patch with work and family issues, so we understood each other's struggles in a way that felt really meaningful. When Silas mentioned he was also thinking about moving to Alaska completely coincidentally, it felt like a sign that there were people out there who understood my need for change and adventure. Caleb had never talked about doing anything spontaneous or exciting with our lives. He was all about stability and routine, which felt suffocating when I was dealing with the reality of how short life could be. Meanwhile, things at work were getting complicated too. My boss, Sterling, had always been friendly, but after my dad died, he started being extra supportive in ways that felt personal rather than professional. He'd check on me throughout the day, offer to let me leave early when I was having a hard time, invite me to grab coffee to talk through what I was going through. Sterling was older, more established, and had this confident way of handling problems that made me feel taken care of. When work stress got overwhelming, he'd suggest we take a walk to discuss projects, which usually turned into longer conversations about life and goals. He understood the corporate world in ways that Caleb never could, and talking to him made me feel sophisticated and valued. The situation with Sterling got weird when he started making comments about how much he'd miss me if I ever left the company, how special I was compared to other employees. But he was my boss, and I really needed the job, especially with all the expenses for my dad's death. When Sterling suggested we meet outside of work to discuss a potential promotion, it felt like an opportunity I couldn't pass up. I knew Caleb wouldn't understand any of this. He'd get jealous about Griffin and Silas, and he'd probably tell me to quit my job rather than deal with Sterling's attention. But Caleb wasn't here dealing with real life. He was on base, living in his structured military world while I was handling grief, work, stress, and loneliness all by myself. So, I managed the situation the way I thought was best. I kept my friendships with Griffin and Silas quiet, used my friend Phoebe's name as a cover when Caleb asked about phone calls, and handled the Sterling situation professionally while protecting my job security. It wasn't ideal, but it was realistic given the circumstances. The thing Caleb didn't understand was that I wasn't just sitting around waiting for him to come home. I was building a support system, maintaining friendships, and dealing with adult responsibilities that required more than his occasional phone calls could provide. When Griffin or Silas talked about Alaska, it felt like they were offering me possibilities for growth and adventure that Caleb had never even considered. Sterling and I did end up spending time together outside of work. He helped me through some really difficult days after Dad's death, and I was grateful for his support even when the situation got complicated. But when things at work became too intense, when Sterling started expecting more from our relationship than I was comfortable with, I made the difficult decision to quit my job. I told Caleb that Sterling had been inappropriate with me, that he'd forced me into uncomfortable situations because he was my boss and I needed the job. It was easier than explaining the complicated reality of how support and friendship could evolve into something more confusing, especially when you're grieving and vulnerable. Caleb was furious about Sterling taking advantage of me, which proved that he wouldn't have understood the nuanced truth about what had actually happened. Even after quitting, Sterling and I stayed in touch. He was going through a divorce and needed someone to talk to, and I understood what it felt like to have your life turned upside down. When he invited me to his house to talk through what we were both going through, it felt like the kind of mature friendship that Caleb wouldn't be capable of understanding. Same with the hiking trips. Sterling knew trails that helped clear your head, and physical activity was good for processing grief. By the time Caleb's deployment was ending, I was managing 3 important friendships that were helping me through the most difficult period of my life. I'd learned to be independent, built a support network, and grown as a person in ways that wouldn't have been possible if I just sat home waiting for Caleb's calls every night. When Caleb came home, I was excited to see him, but I also felt nervous about how he'd adjust to the person I'd become. I'd gotten used to making my own decisions, having conversations with people who challenged me intellectually, and not having to explain every aspect of my social life to someone who got insecure about normal friendships. Caleb seemed different too. More serious, more observant. He started noticing things about my phone habits that he'd never paid attention to before, like how I'd flip my phone face down during conversations or step into the other room to take certain calls. But I'd gotten used to privacy over the past year, and it felt invasive having someone monitor my communication again. I could tell Caleb was suspicious about something, but I figured he was just readjusting to being home. He'd always been the jealous type, and deployment had probably made his insecurity worse. I tried to be extra affectionate and attentive to help him feel secure, but he seemed distracted and distant despite my efforts. What I didn't realize was that Caleb was watching me more carefully than I thought. Apparently, he'd been paying attention to how I entered my phone password, studying my finger movements over several days until he figured out the pattern. The level of surveillance felt like something out of a spy movie, but Caleb had always been methodical about things that worried him. The night everything came out, I'd had a few drinks while we watched a movie. Nothing crazy, just enough wine to relax after a stressful day. I fell asleep on the couch and Caleb carried me to bed like he always did when I'd had too much to drink. It was sweet, and I remember thinking maybe we were finally getting back to normal. I woke up the next morning feeling slightly hungover, but okay. Caleb was already up making coffee, and he seemed quiet but not unusual. We went through our normal morning routine. I showered, got dressed, checked my phone for messages. Everything seemed fine until later that evening when Caleb asked me to sit down on the couch because we needed to talk. The way he said it made my stomach drop. Caleb had never been the type to initiate serious conversations, so I knew something was wrong. He was holding some papers and had this expression I'd never seen before. Determined, but also hurt. "I need to ask you about some phone calls," he said. And his voice was steady in a way that scared me. "Specifically, this number that called you multiple times last week." I looked at the call log he was showing me, and my mind went completely blank. I couldn't remember who had called or why. And Caleb was staring at me like he expected an immediate explanation. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Could have been anyone. Maybe a wrong number." "For 45 minutes, Caleb asked, "and you called them back twice." I felt this panic rising in my chest, but I tried to stay calm. "Maybe it was my friend Phoebe. We talk for a long time sometimes." Caleb nodded slowly, but something about his expression told me he didn't believe me. "Okay, so if I call this number right now, Phoebe will answer." "I don't know, Caleb. What the hell is this about?" Why are you interrogating me about phone calls like I'm some kind of criminal? Instead of answering, Caleb pulled out more papers, screenshots of text messages, call logs, even some photos that looked like they were taken secretly. My heart started racing as I realized how much information he had. I know about Griffin, he said quietly. I know you didn't stop talking to him like you promised. I know about the Alaska conversations, the messages about thinking of each other every day, all of it. I felt like someone had just turned the volume down on everything around me. Caleb had been investigating me, collecting evidence like I was some kind of suspect. The betrayal of that felt almost worse than being caught. It's just a friend. And it's all jokes, I said, which was true. Griffin and I had never done anything physical, never even talked about it seriously. You're making this sound like something it's not. What about Silas? Caleb asked. And I realized how deep his investigation had gone. The guy who's also planning to move to Alaska with you. The one you've been talking to every day since your dad died. I could feel my face getting hot. Silas has been there for me during the worst time of my life, Caleb. While you were overseas, I was dealing with my father's death and needed support from people who were actually here. And Sterling. Caleb's voice was getting quieter, which somehow made it more terrifying. Your former boss, who you claimed sexually assaulted you, the one you've been visiting at his house and going on 4-hour hikes with? My mouth went completely dry. I had no idea Caleb knew about Sterling, and the way he said it made everything sound so much worse than it actually was. Sterling did take advantage of me, I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. He was my boss and I needed the job. So, when he pushed for more than I was comfortable with, I felt forced to go along with it. But, after I quit, we stayed friends because we were both going through difficult times. Caleb stared at me for a long moment. So, you're telling me that the man who sexually assaulted you is someone you choose to spend hours alone with? Someone you trust enough to go to his house and on isolated hiking trails? When he put it like that, it sounded insane. But the reality was more complicated than Caleb could understand. Sterling hadn't assaulted me. That was just the easiest way to explain why I'd quit. And our friendship afterward was genuine, even if it was also complicated. You don't understand the situation, I said. It's not black and white like you're making it sound. Caleb pulled out his phone and started reading directly from screenshots. Messages between Griffin and me about missing each other. Conversations with Silas about starting fresh somewhere new. Texts with Sterling about meeting up. Seeing it all together like that, presented as evidence, made everything look different than it had felt in the moment. I gave you multiple chances to tell me the truth, Caleb said. I asked about the phone calls, gave you opportunities to explain what's been going on. Instead, you lied to my face and swore on your mother's life that you were being honest with me. I remember doing that, swearing on Mom's life when Caleb had seemed suspicious about something weeks earlier. At the time, it felt like I was being honest about the important things, even if I wasn't sharing every detail of my friendships. I didn't lie about anything that mattered, I said. These are friendships, Caleb. I know how they might look taken out of context, but I haven't cheated on you. I haven't done anything that actually violated our marriage. You've been planning to move to Alaska with 2 different men, Caleb said. You've been having an emotional relationship with your former boss while claiming he assaulted you. You've been living a completely separate life behind my back for months. The way Caleb laid it out made it sound so calculated and horrible. But from my perspective, I'd been surviving a difficult time as best I could. I'd been lonely, grieving, and trying to build connections with people who could offer support that Caleb couldn't provide from overseas. I never intended for any of this to happen, I said, which was true. I didn't plan to develop feelings for these people. But you were gone, Caleb. You were living your life on base while I was here dealing with real problems alone. So, this is my fault? Caleb asked. Because I was deployed. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the situation was complicated and I did the best I could with what I was dealing with. Caleb was quiet for a long time, just staring at the papers in his hands. When he finally looked up, his expression was different. Sadder, but also harder. If there's anything else I find out you're lying about, I'm done, he said. This is your chance to tell me everything, because I can't handle discovering more lies later. And I swore to him that I'd told him everything important, that there were no more secrets between us. And in my mind, that was true. The details of my friendships with Griffin, Silas, and Sterling were complicated. But the core of what Caleb needed to know that I loved him and wanted to make our marriage work was honest. That was 3 weeks ago, and Caleb still acts like I'm some kind of monster. He barely touches me, gives me these careful, polite responses when I try to talk to him, and flinches when I try to be affectionate. I've been nothing but sweet and patient, trying to show him that we can move past this, but he seems determined to punish me indefinitely. I understand that Caleb was hurt by discovering my friendships the way he did, but at some point, he needs to decide whether he wants to be married or whether he wants to keep wallowing in drama. I've explained my side. I've been extra attentive and loving, and I've cut off contact with Griffin, Silas, and Sterling to show my commitment to our marriage. What more does Caleb want from me? I was dealing with grief, loneliness, and work stress while he was overseas, living his structured military life. I built friendships with people who could provide support he wasn't available to give. Maybe I wasn't perfect in how I handled everything, but I was doing the best I could under difficult circumstances. Now Caleb sits around looking wounded and betrayed like he's the only person who's ever been hurt in a relationship. He can barely kiss me without this pained expression. And when I try to initiate intimacy, he goes through the motions but clearly isn't present. It's like he's determined to make me pay for having a social life while he was deployed. The most frustrating part is that Caleb keeps saying he doesn't know if he can trust me again, as if I'm some serial cheater who's been running around town. I had friendships. Complicated ones maybe, but friendships with people who were there for me when I needed support. I never physically cheated, never stopped loving my husband, and never intended to hurt anyone. But Caleb has turned this into some massive betrayal that's apparently unforgivable. He talks to his friends about our problems, probably making me sound like some terrible wife who was plotting to run away to Alaska. Meanwhile, I'm the one doing all the work to repair our relationship while he just sits there being sad and distant. I love Caleb and I want our marriage to work, but I can't keep apologizing forever for having friends who supported me through the hardest time of my life. At some point, he needs to acknowledge that deployment is hard on both people in a marriage and that I was dealing with real problems while he was gone. If he can't understand that, maybe we're just not compatible anymore. I've been the perfect wife for 3 weeks now, attentive, affectionate, completely focused on his needs and feelings. But Caleb seems more interested in staying hurt than in moving forward together. People go through rough patches in marriage, and couples who really love each other find ways to work through problems instead of dwelling on them forever. If Caleb decides he can't get past this, that's his choice. But I'm not going to keep walking on eggshells around his feelings when I know in my heart that I was just trying to survive a difficult time the best way I knew how.